Okay, well, the bad children always go to the balcony. Here, here.
Easton, come sit down, please.
How many of you have been here before? Okay. Anybody want to tell the story?
No, we want to hear you tell.
Well, we got you here.
Hey, there's always a shot. I haven't gotten out of it yet, so. Well, welcome to Cane Ridge. Cane Ridge was named by Daniel Boone back when he surveyed this part of the country. Called it Cane Ridge because of the cane growing on the ridge. It's not an original title, but it's descriptive. What we're talking about is a Native American bamboo. It grows naturally. They tell me just about every region of the country has some kind of bamboo. The kind we have is not like the Asian varieties. It is not as tall nor as thick in general. This gets about 15 feet tall, about as thick as my thumb. It's not good for much of anything. It does make a fairly good fishing pole. Nobody needs that many fishing poles. You see, it grew 17 miles along this ridge, and at the widest point, they say about 7.5 miles wide. And that's what they call a cane break, because it quite literally stops you from traveling. It is a dense woody grass that sends runners and rhizomes out underground 12 to 20 feet away. So it doesn't care if you put a driveway in, it'll come up on the other side. It might even come up through it. And in fact, it's all over my garden over there if anybody would like to take it. I'll give you the shovel myself, because you have to dig it out. You can't cut it or burn it because it will still come back. It is difficult to remove, but what Daniel Boone knew was that cane grows on riverbanks and marshes where it's wet, and so it indicates good soil. We don't have a riverbank or a marsh up here. The highest point in the county, they say, is just up here in the next field. And so what he knew was the soil must hold water fairly well. This is some of the richest farmland in Kentucky. He told people back east that it grew the sweetest corn he'd ever tasted, and that they should come and farm the cane breaks of Kentucky. And on his advice, a Presbyterian church that was in the mountains of North Carolina came here. Somehow he was acquainted with their minister, a Presbyterian preacher named Robert Finley. We don't quite know how they became acquainted. We do know they were both born in the same part of Pennsylvania, up in Bucks County, but then they also both lived in the same part of North Carolina. So just where and how they met, we don't know. But apparently they trusted his opinion. It took them a little while to get here. They essentially came in two different groups. The first came through the southern path, the Wilderness Road or the Cumberland Gap. The second group came through the northern route, down the Ohio River, and got off at what was called Limestone Landing, or Maysville today. Somehow, they both found their way here. Now, they didn't have GPS in those days, so it's pretty amazing that they managed to do that. But if you have GPS, you may have noticed even it doesn't get you here. Mine sends me 2 miles down the road, and some of them send people a quarter mile the other way. So it is not as reliable as we'd like to believe. Well, this congregation came here in 1790. They built the building in 1791. It's believed that this is the largest one-room log building in the country. It's roughly 30 by 50 feet, almost 30 feet to the peak of the roof. Unnecessarily tall. We could have put a third floor up there if we'd really wanted to. We think there are probably a couple of reasons for that. The first being that if you are familiar with old homes, they often had very high ceilings. That way the heat would rise and the cooler air stayed down here below. But this was also their fortress, just in case the Indians were to attack. And so, standing in a field of cane that grew 15 feet tall, you'd like to be able to see it, especially if you're running and there's somebody behind you. So a 30-foot building in a sea of 15-foot cane makes a lot of sense. The old roadway used to run right out here. If You saw a line of picnic tables over there. That is the old road bed. It was actually compressed rock, very much like gravel today. And if you dig down a couple of inches, you'll still find that rock bed. It used to join up with what we call Jackstown Pike over a few miles that way at Black's Crossroads. We don't have an exact date as to when that stopped being used as a road, but essentially this door faced that way, and we would consider it the front door, although they didn't really make any distinction. There is a piece of correspondence we have in the museum dated 1796. Somebody who lives in this area wrote back to somebody in Pennsylvania, and they said they lived within a mile of the Cane Ridge Meetin' House, Meaten. Spelling's changed a little bit. But it proves this building was a landmark as early as 1796, years before anything really happened here. The building has a couple of unique features we like to point out. These alcoves on either side, these offsets as we call them. You will hear many things about those, and they're often wrong. Some will tell you that it forms the shape of a cross, and it is technically true. But if that had been their goal, they would have probably made wider arms. It also gives you 12 corners, they say, for the 12 apostles. It's a wonderful teaching tool, but it's a whole lot of work to make one little point. In truth, it's a structural point, because if you tried to find one log, the length of the building, 50 feet or so, and you managed to knock that tree down and square it up and then lift it into place, you've probably done 3 impossible things in one day. And it would have begun to bow right there in the middle under its own weight. Instead, they used 3 logs to equal the length, requiring these offsets, which are the equivalent of 2 columns in the center of the wall. Makes it actually 3 times as strong. It's the difference between a single sheet of paper standing on its edge and a sheet of corrugated cardboard standing up. And when you have a beam running this way that's 34 feet long and about 12 by 12 inches square, and probably weighed close to 2.5 or 3 tons when it was first put up there, you'd really like that kind of support holding it up. I wouldn't still be sitting right here in the middle if I didn't believe in it. We also note these corners. A lot of people will call those dovetails. They are not. A dovetail is shaped like the tail of a dove. This technically is called an inverted V notch, or an upside down V. In Pennsylvania, they call it a German notch. Some places call it a cathedral notch because of that point. In Kentucky, we call it a saddle notch because everything has to relate to the horse, especially as you get closer to the Derby. Well, that shape, that upside down V, is one of the strongest joints. The more weight you put on it, the less likely those boards will twist apart. And then they drilled down through those corners. They put in oak pegs, 3 and 4 feet long, 1 inch to 1.5 inches thick. When that oak swells a little bit, those corners simply do not move. The architects evaluated this building for us back in 1932 and determined it hadn't shifted from its original position more than 1.5 inches since 1791. You cannot say that about most modern buildings. These people, despite the primitive tools by our standards, they knew what they were doing. We have a lot of those kinds of tools down in the museum, so you can see just how hard they had to work to build a building like this. The walls are made of blue ash. Blue ash is one of the hardest Kentucky hardwoods. So hard that termites won't eat it. One reason the building's even still here. The upper portions are mostly oak and chestnut, and the roof is hand-split oak shingles. The flooring was dirt, and the walls had no chinking between the logs, and no windows. They literally looked through the walls. Part of that is so that they could look out and watch for the Indians. The Shawnee and the Cherokee were the 2 primary tribes in this area. They did not live in Kentucky year-round. Shawnee came down from Ohio and the Cherokee up from North Carolina and Tennessee, and they hunted in Kentucky. had what we would call a semi-permanent settlement, places where they did a little farming, but in the winter they would take what they had trapped and grown and go home. The thing is, by 1796, the settlers were pouring across the borders, coming in by the droves. And basically the Indians recognized they were not going to win anymore. Now in western Kentucky there were other tribes, and they had other difficulties there. But in this part of the country, that Indian threat pretty much had gone away by 1796. That meant they could make improvements to the building. That's when they put the chinking between the logs and they cut windows in. They also plastered, no, I'm getting ahead of myself. That's not what they put in then. I've told this story twice today, so I'm having to remember where I am. The floor was dirt, but in 1796 they put a puncheon log floor in. It is a half log, round side on the bottom, flat side on top. It's kind of like walking in a fun house if you've ever tried it. Everything moves just a little bit. They sat on puncheon log benches, half logs, 4 legs, no back. We have a sample of that outside the window over here. You can imagine sitting on that for a 3-hour service, and then coming back in the afternoon for another 3-hour service, and probably in the summer, coming back in the evening for yet one more service. Those are not going to be the most comfortable things you sit on all day. Well, the balcony is a freestanding balcony. It's not attached to the walls anywhere. And they had no stairs. They climbed ladders through the windows at the top. And that's where the slaves used to sit. Called it the slaves' gallery. This was an abolitionist church. That's not that they all agreed on that. But early on, they were freeing their slaves with some regularity. So that by 1829, they no longer needed the balcony. Everybody was sitting down here together. And yes, their freed African Americans became members of the congregation. Not that they were truly equal, but we do know there were African American deacons. We don't have an actual record that states this, but there is a small chance that there might have been one who was considered an elder, although there's simply no documentation for that. So, by 1829, the balcony was removed, used as a hayloft in a barn just down the road, where it sat for the next 100 years. All of that meant more improvements could be made to the building. A ceiling was put in under these main beams up there, and that meant a pot-bellied stove could come in for the very first time to heat the building. Imagine coming here in the winter, you think it's cool today. Come back in January, you won't stay long, believe me. Pot-bellied stove was here, and you can see scorch marks on either side there where coals fell out over the years. It's astounding this building never actually burned. They plastered the walls. You see the stripes over here where the lathwork was once attached. And on the outside, they put white clapboard siding. Looked like all the other little country churches when they put in the glass windows. We have some photos out here on the outside of this building that show just what it looked like in the 1920s before this was renovated in 32. They changed out the pews. They brought in plank pews with a board across the back. And the last of those is also out there so you can see. While there was something to lean against, it wasn't a whole lot better. They brought in tallow candle chandeliers. Does everybody know what tallow is? My little scientist over here. Any idea? Tallow is beef fat. And they would render that. That is, you get a great big cauldron outside, and you do it outside because you do not want to smell this indoors for long. And you take all the fat you can find for a certain amount of time, and you start boiling it. And you get rid of the liquid, and what you're left with is kind of like wax. And you pour it into a mold with a wick, and then you use it like a candle. The only problem is, it has a bit of an odor, both in making and in burning. It's a yellow sputtering flame, so it's not all that bright. and it leaves an oily soot on everything. So you don't really want to use it unless you absolutely have to. So if it's dark and overcast like it is today, you might, and if it's an evening service, you might. But the rest of the time, nobody had to really read anything in church. The minister had his own window, and as long as he or one of the elders could read the scriptures, you were set, because you probably didn't have a hymnal. And even if you had a hymnal, it probably wasn't the same one your neighbor owned. And there were no bulletins, of course. Everything was pretty much read to you, or spoken off the cuff. So you didn't really have to burn light all the time. They continued until 1882, when they had what they called their modernization and beautification campaign. They papered the walls. And then they closed this door, moved the pulpit to that end. They reoriented everything. These pews were brought in to face that direction. There was a center aisle still around the pot-bellied stove. Most of the bad kids went up there. They changed out the tallow candle chandeliers for oil lamp chandeliers. That is probably whale oil, an expensive prospect because you have to import all of that. There is no ocean anywhere nearby. It was also something that left an oily soot on everything. So again, you didn't burn them unless you had to. They brought in an organ at that point, a pump organ. This is not the original. The original disappeared in the 1920s. This one is actually slightly older, and it does still play beautifully. It's one of the few instruments that stays in tune in a building that's not heated or air conditioned. The piano back there is hopeless. There is no way of keeping it in tune now. The church continued then until 1921, and that's when they had to close their doors. We are not the fastest growing section of the state. There were a lot more choices to go to. Roads were being paved and people were buying automobiles. Just easier to go somewhere else. And as you might have noticed, it isn't the most comfortable building in the world. There were no padded seats, no restrooms attached, and no classrooms or fellowship hall. Most every other church had begun to add those things. So in 1921, they closed. The building was still used occasionally for a meeting or a hymn sing or sometimes a family reunion. Nobody was taking really good care of it. You could get the key from the next door neighbor. In fact, they had a little sign on their back porch that said key. We have that in the museum. It was secure, but it wasn't something that you couldn't get into if you wanted to. Well, people began to remember there was something that had happened here. So in 1932, despite the Depression, the locals had a lot of time and talent, and they restored the building to what you see today. The balcony was still down in the barn where it had been for 100 years and brought back, except for these two center posts and that center beam. This is the original balcony. We did add the stairs. Nobody wanted to climb those ladders anymore in our Sunday clothes. We left this floor and these pews, but otherwise, this is about what it looked like in 1796. The problem is, being here on the ridge, when the wind and rain and snow come through this county, comes across the ridge pretty hard. The building was not going to last another generation if something wasn't done to preserve it. So after some consideration, in 1954 they began the outer building. This is made of local Cane Ridge golden limestone. That color is found within about a 12-mile radius here. The flooring out there comes out of Jessamine County, down by the Kentucky River. And the roof is 50 tons of slate on top of 3-inch gypsum panels. Makes it roughly a fireproof building. And we don't allow any open flame inside today. Now that cost us about $120,000 back in 1957. They tell us we can't replace it for $2 million. So we're pretty glad they did it when they did it. It was $20,000 over budget as it was. Most every good church project is. The question then is, why did we bother to save something out here in the middle of Irving County? Well, we have to go back to the start with Robert Finley and his church. Finley apparently was a pretty well-liked pastor. He served here in the Concord Church about 10 miles that way, and he taught in the Log Cabin Seminary a quarter mile to the east. But Finley had some difficulties with the presbytery. He was accused of a few different things. The two worst were insubordination and public inebriety. That is, he was inebriated in public. The account actually reads, Robert Finley could not sit his horse. And remember, we are in Kentucky. It's a very serious offense. It's practically a DUI. He got mad, and the presbytery got mad about the same time, and it was mutually agreed that he would no longer be here. Moved up to Chillicothe, Ohio, and took most of both congregations with him. Loyal people in those days. They say he later sobered up and became a Methodist preacher. We don't know which one of those happened first, but he had two sons who became Methodist preachers as well, so apparently it took. They also say he must have been forgiven because he came back and preached at the revival. Well, that left both churches in desperate need. The man we have pictured over here, Burton Warren Stone, just happened to be somewhere nearby, and he needed something to do for the winter. Stone was from Port Tobacco, Maryland. Anybody? Port Tobacco? Anybody? 10 years, 2 people have ever been there. If you know where Waldorf or La Plata are, you're not too far. If you know where Washington, D.C. is, you're kind of across the river. Well, Port Tobacco was a shallow water port in the early days of the colonies, and they shipped tobacco out of there. The problem is, as the colonies grew, so did the ships, and they simply could not harbor in a shallow water port. And so it fell out of favor pretty fast. But Thomas Stone, Barton Stone's cousin, lived there, and his home today is a national park because Thomas was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, third signature below John Hancock. So it had some claim to fame in those days. But when Barton was about 3 and a half, his father died. And by the time he was 7, his mother had moved the family to Virginia. She had adult children living there somewhere between Roanoke and the North Carolina line, and they could help raise her younger children. Stone got 5 years of education there in Virginia, and when he received his inheritance, what small amount there was, he decided to spend it on more education. Moved to North Carolina, to the Guilford Academy, in what is present-day Greensboro. There, a Presbyterian preacher named David Caldwell was teaching school. Caldwell was himself a graduate of the College of New Jersey, what was to become Princeton one day. And in fact, his school is sometimes referred to as the Princeton of the South. He lived to be 99 years old. He was a Revolutionary War veteran. He had studied the law, and he was a self-taught physician. Think about that one. Self-taught physician. He actually did some of that by correspondence. The internet has nothing on anyone today. They tell me he was the best doctor for miles around. It is quite likely he was the only doctor, but he was still the best. He had battlefield experience, and that counts for quite a bit in those days. Well, Stone went down there to study the law. It's what the family had always done, and it's where the money was. But while there, he had a conversion experience. Determined that he'd become a Presbyterian preacher. So he graduated after 3 years. Moved down to Georgia to live with his brother and to teach languages at the Hope Hull Methodist Academy. But he considered that it was not quite what he was called to do. Now, Stone had learned Latin and Greek while he was in college. 3 years, 2 languages. He later learned French on his own. He learned Hebrew from a Jewish physician in Lexington. And he figured out how to write Cherokee phonetically before Sequoia's alphabet of the Cherokee language was made known. That's 5 languages as an adult. It's pretty impressive. You will hear him sometimes referred to as a backwoods preacher, and they don't mean that as a compliment. The truth is he was probably one of the most brilliant men out here despite the fact that he preached in the backwoods. Well, he was on an evangelistic tour, raising money and preaching, when his horse became lame somewhere along the Tennessee-Kentucky line. And his companions abandoned him on the road. You've got to be careful who you travel with. We had a man left here one day by a group, so I suggest everybody count before you take off. I will put them to work if they are still here. Well, Stone was not the best frontiersman, most likely, but he was a smart man, and he realized you do not travel back across the mountains by yourself in the winter with a lame horse. So he appealed to the presbytery for something to do, and they assigned him to Cane Ridge in Concord. My personal feeling is they were glad to get rid of him because these churches were having opinions, and they wanted somebody who was educated, a Presbyterian preacher who could take control. But it was just to be a short-term winter assignment. But they liked him, and so they asked if he would stay. He did go home briefly, closed out his affairs, and came back, was ordained in this building in 1798. And that's when he showed his first problems with the Presbyterian Church. The question is asked, can you follow the Westminster Confession of Faith, a creed? And his response was something like, insofar as I find it consistent with the Word of God. Which, if you followed that, you'll realize he didn't actually answer the question. The truth is, he sort of said no. But they really needed clergy out here, and so they let it go. And he was frankly not the only one saying such things. There had been debates about the Westminster Confession for more than a century, and others were saying that. Well, they say that Stone added 30 members to this church and 50 members to the Concord Church in a very short amount of time. That's pretty impressive in any day, but considering our population out here hasn't changed that much, that's an awful lot of people in farm country. The problem he began to realize, along with a lot of his colleagues, was that Kentucky had some issues. We were a new state, only since 1792. We did not have law officials all over the place, nor did we have churches, or even clergy to fill the pulpits that we had. Kentucky was called an immoral place, a place that one minister said they would just as soon slit your throat as shake your hand. Not the travel brochure we want to publish. So they realized something like 15% of the population attended church with any regularity, not just in Kentucky, but the entirety of the country. You see, after the Revolution, there was no longer a state-sponsored church. No taxes were going to the church. And during the Revolution, the Anglican clergy went home. Those who couldn't get to England escaped to Canada because they were considered to be Tories or Loyalists. That meant there were empty churches all over the place. In fact, it would be until the mid-1800s before some of those deeds were actually cleared up. And the Presbyterians and the Baptists and the Methodists were not ready to fill the gaps that had been left. So nobody was attending church. And in this part of the country, it was worse because we didn't have the number of churches they had back east, and we did not have the clergy to take care of the problem. Well, as it happened, a man named James McGready was preaching down in Logan County, Kentucky, the western part of the state, there on the Tennessee border just past Bowling Green. Served the Red River, the Muddy River, and the Gasper River meeting houses. And he and Stone were acquaintances from his days back in the Guilford Academy in North Carolina. Well, when the Presbyterians held revivals, they would hold it around their sacramental season, the time when they would serve communion, which in most cases on the frontier was maybe yearly, occasionally twice yearly or even quarterly, but for the most part it was hard enough to get them together once every year. Stone went down to the Red River to see what was going on and to help with communion. And for the most part, he liked what he was seeing there. These revivals were starting to happen all around, getting a bit of a reputation. So he decided to come back to Bourbon County and try that here. His first revival was over at the Concord Church in June of 1801. only 6,000 or 7,000 showed up. But apparently it was worth trying again. So he scheduled the second one for here. But he did put it off by a month. He got married first. Went out to Greenville, Kentucky, back out west, to get married to Eliza Campbell on July 3rd of 1801. He says in his autobiography that Eliza was pious, intelligent, and cheerful. It's about as romantic as it got. He later wrote an 18-verse elegy when she died, but it's kind of late then. He brought her back here for the revival to begin on August 6th of 1801, and it rained for the first 3 days. You might have noticed a little bit of that out there, but they say there were torrential downpours at times. The revival, however, lasted for 7 days, August 6th through 13th. They say in the course of those days, somewhere between 25 and 30,000 people showed up around this building, camping for 1.5 miles. They camped in tents and wagons and lean-tos, and some just spread out on the open ground. There were tents in this direction like city blocks, 6 or 8 rows of them, military fashion. The locals left some fields unharvested so that their horses and cattle would have something to eat. And yes, they brought their cattle and their chickens with them so they'd have fresh milk and eggs. They were pretty self-sufficient people. But there were a lot of things going on. Barton Stone had recruited between 40 and 50 ministers, Baptist, Methodist, and Presbyterian. Unheard of for them to work together, much less talk. He even got most of them to agree they would preach on the love of God and not the fear of God, as many of them were wont to do. James McGready was said to have been able to preach the kind of sermon where you would actually feel as if the very depths of hell had opened up at your feet, and you could smell the brimstone burning. It wasn't the kind of preacher that Barton Stone was, and he was more focused on the love of God. Well, there were lots of things going on because, frankly, this was as much social event as it was religious. Most of these people, because they weren't going to church regularly, were frankly here to see the show. These things were getting such a reputation. And most of them lived outside of the cities. They lived on farms, sometimes far enough away that they would only get to town once or twice a year. So this was an opportunity to meet people and to trade goods and information. And frankly, you were usually related to half the people you lived near. If you wanted to find a mate, this is the sort of thing you'd come to, because they would be as adventurous as you and probably somewhat like-minded. Well, there were hawkers all around, selling their wares, standing on the backs of wagons, and they were evangelists of a type. They could be heard and seen. If they had food, they probably got wealthy. And this is Bourbon County. They say the Spirit may have been here, but the spirits flowed freely. There were lots of accusations of public drunkenness, not only among those who participated, but among the clergy as well. We also know there were women of questionable reputation, and I'll just leave that one there. There was so much going on that the military came in to try to maintain order. We also think they're the ones who may have set up the tents, because that was done in a military fashion. We think they may have helped bring in water as well, because there is no water source up here on the ridge. And we think it's possible that they helped with latrine duty. We really hope somebody did. You can imagine the kind of atmosphere that was happening. The Barton Stone had recruited Baptist, Methodist, and Presbyterian preachers, 40 or 50 of them. It's amazing that they actually worked together. And they were standing outside, 6 or 7 at a time, preaching, standing on stumps and logs and wagons. They say one sat up on a tree limb to be seen and heard, and the Presbyterians built a platform over here that had a roof over it so that their minister could be seen and protected from the elements. Now, all of that would have been plenty, this circus-like atmosphere that had grown up. But they were also singing and praying and studying their Bibles in small groups. And then you had what they call the religious exercises, the spiritual manifestations. They say the Holy Spirit came down, inhabited the human body, and caused people to do some pretty strange and unusual things. Some have termed this acrobatic Christianity. There are about 15 of these exercises that they talk about. Some are simply variations on each other, and some are different names for each other. We give a short list as to what may have happened here. You had one they called the rolling exercise, where they would literally roll on the ground back and forth, hour after hour, in holy ecstasy, they said. And remember, it rained for the first 3 days. There should be an image or two forming about now. You had one they called the rocking exercise, where they would begin to rock back and forth, and it would become so fast and violent their foreheads touched the ground in front, and the back of their head the ground behind. They say they moved so quickly their facial features became indistinct. Then you have one they called the running exercise, where they would literally run as far and fast as they could in a straight line sometimes until they literally fell down from exhaustion. Others were said to run around in circles in the camp until they fell as well. And there are a couple of accounts we know of both night and day, because there are those who ran into trees in the middle of this. You have one that they call the jerks, where their bodies moved uncontrollably, their arms and legs flailing about, heads snapping back and forth, and if they fell to the ground, they are said to have continued to writhe and dance upon their backs. Then you have the ones they call the vocal emanations, sounds they made. Some, they say, were stricken with bouts of holy laughter, where they simply could not stop laughing for hours sometimes. But it wasn't like having the giggles in church. This was a grave and earnest laughter, the kind that made you want to know what they were laughing about, but not necessarily want to join in. They also say holy laughter afflicted more of the churchgoers, whereas these other physical kinds of things tended to afflict those who did not go to church. There's one they called singing from the breast, hymns and tunes that came through the chest wall, not through the voice box, sounds, they say, of an angelic origin, never before heard on earth. Barton Stone even called it ethereal. They say it was like a low hum or a deep chant. And then possibly the most controversial of all of these was the one they called the barking exercise. There were literally those on all fours on the ground howling at the moon, while others, they say, surrounded the trees as if barking the devil up a tree, like a coon dog would tree a raccoon. They also say this is where the phrase, "you're barking up the wrong tree," came from. I told you cannot make these things up. The last of the exercises that we mention here is probably the most prevalent here. That is called the falling exercise, where they would literally fall down unconscious for hours on end, sometimes emitting a shrill shriek as they went down, moaning and sighing throughout the day or night. They would assign people to bring them indoors at first to protect them. And then they say they fell so hard and fast it looked like an artillery barrage was loosed upon the crowd, 500 or so at the time. And they just started roping off part of the forest, assigning people to stand there to watch them to make sure they were okay. Barton Stone would sit by some of them, and he wanted no other influence before they woke up. And by and large, they told him they felt euphoric or ecstatic or the best they'd ever felt in their lives. He was convinced these things were the work of the Spirit, although there were many who thought they were satanic in origin. These were quite different from what happened in church generally. He would probably rather we remember, though, that in the course of those 7 days, somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 were saved. But of course, it's the other stuff that gets reported most often. They stopped after 7 days because they literally ran out of food. Nothing left. And they say the horses and cattle had eaten every blade of grass to the ground for 1.5 miles around the building. You can imagine that mess. 25,000 people and their animals, 3 days of rain, and no grass left. There are people who would like you to believe this happened regularly here. It did not. It happened in many places around, but it was once in 1801 here. My personal feeling is that as soon as that last wagon pulled out, fence posts started going in the ground so that they would not do it again. Because quite honestly, these farmers lost crops that animals had eaten and crops that got trampled over. This was their livelihood. This is what they needed for the winter. So they probably would not allow that again. Well, the clergy were censured for their participation by many of the church offices, especially the presbytery. Many of them were asked not to do such things. They were often lumped together in a group they called the revival men. That was not a complimentary term. Barton Stone and his colleagues realized that they were about to be called on the carpet next. So they withdrew from the local presbytery and created their own. 15 churches and about 6 ministers. It grew a little bit. They called it Springfield Presbytery. But after 9 months, they recognized the system itself was part of the problem they were having. And so they dissolved that with a document they called the Last Will and Testament of Springfield Presbytery. They killed it. Now it's an ironic document, satirical, because they killed something that had never actually been alive. And you have to read it that way. They were making a serious point, but they were using humor to do it. That left them outside of the Presbyterian Church. Now, of those 6 signers, 2 did go back to the Presbytery eventually. 2 became Shakers, leaving Barton Stone and David Providence here. Well, their discussions led them to believe that those that followed Christ should go by the name of Christian and Christian only. And so this literally became the first Christian church of the movement. We had a huge effect in Kentucky. Dozens of Presbyterian churches either came over together or split because of this. There were those in surrounding areas who began to join with this movement. There were at least 5 different groups calling themselves Christian at the same time. A group down in North Carolina and Virginia, who had been the Republican Methodist, began using the name Christian. A group up in New England, under the leadership of Elias Smith and Abner Jones, were using the term Christian. Many of them would eventually join with the Congregationalists later. And then there was a group in Ohio that called themselves the Christian Connection. They were a different group entirely. Some of their people were crossing over to join with Stone, and some were going other ways. But it was the group that called themselves the Disciples of Christ that had been started up in the mountains of Virginia by Thomas and Alexander Campbell. They had, that part of Virginia later became West Virginia. But they had left Ireland and Scotland in 1807 and 1809, come to America and left the Presbyterian Church and joined the Baptist. Then they had a falling out with the Baptist and separated and created their own group. They called themselves the Reformers or the Disciples of Christ. Alexander preferred that term to Christian, but in 1832 the 2 groups had gotten together and they recognized they were talking about very similar things. And so on New Year's Day of 1832 in Lexington in the Hill Street Christian Church, the 2 groups came together. Barton Stone and Raccoon John Smith shook hands. And Raccoon John Smith is a whole lecture unto himself, believe me. They essentially created the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. There were those who preferred one or the other term, some who used Church of Christ, but they were all one body at the time. However, even though we were a unity movement, we have split. There are now 3 main bodies and a few dozen splinter groups of all of them. They call this the birthplace. The Christian Church Disciples of Christ, the Christian Churches and Churches of Christ, and the Church of Christ a cappella, or non-instrumental. All 3 agree this is the birthplace, even though we don't talk a lot amongst ourselves. We are still affiliated with the Disciples, but we are not funded through them. We are a private, non-profit institution, And we receive no money from them or through the state. Everything is by donation. Means we operate on a shoestring. It also means that we're open to anybody to have a Christian service here. We don't ask for rent, we just ask for donations. Do take some time. I know it's wet outside, but Barton Stone is buried out here. It's the third time he's been buried. We finally kept him down. It's hard to keep a good man down. He died in Hannibal, Missouri, and was buried twice in Jacksonville, Illinois, before being brought here in 1847. His first wife, Eliza, is buried right next to him. She had been buried on the family farm and then brought over after he was. The windows out here in the shrine, each one tells part of the story. Each has a plaque that explains it. The museum is open. It has some of Stone's artifacts as well as the church, and a room full of tools of the era. And that's also where the gift shop and the restrooms are, which is usually the next question. I'm glad to answer anything I can, either now or as you wander around. But thank you all.
Is that
Most of
one
these
solid wall
folks
up
have
there?
been,
I'm sorry. Did I answer? I can't hear.
Is that one solid log up there? That top one?
This one is,
The very top, yeah.
is actually joined above that center beam.
Okay.
Yeah.
most of these folks are from Georgetown, have been listening to me talk several nights and most of today about some of the Raccoon John Smith stories and the stories of the Stone and the Campbell movements merging. This great crossing near Georgetown is the place where some of the prep discussion was done for the 1832 January 1 meeting. But one of the questions that came up, we were at Midway earlier this morning, is Adam Hibbler's grave is somewhere, and I